The very moment I set foot on my new property, the head of the HOA stormed up uninvited, demanding that I relinquish the waterfront section of my land. She claimed, based on some fabricated deal with the prior owner, that it actually belonged to the neighborhood. According to her, I didn't truly own the spacia, and she made it crystal clear that she'd do everything in her power to make my life miserable. What she failed to understand was that this cabin wasn't just a getaway, it was the result of a long, hard journey, and I wasn't about to roll over without a fight. So tell me, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments. After nearly 2 decades of pulling 18-hour shifts, building a software business from nothing, enduring 3 brutal rounds of VC funding, and countless nights passed out on an office couch, I'd finally made it. My dream, a peaceful lakeside retreat, now mine. That first morning, I sank into a deck chair, wrapped my hands around a hot mug of coffee, and let the quiet wash over me. It was astonishing how loud silence could be when you've spent years surrounded by the endless chaos of city life. It was the first time in ages I could actually hear myself think, or maybe even hear my own heartbeat. The lake was still, tranquil. It whispered promises of peace I'd never known. The real estate agent had called the place a hidden treasure, and now, watching the sun stretch golden light across the glassy water, I finally understood what she meant. The absence of car horns, inbox pings, and back-to-back meetings felt surreal. No fires to put out, no emergencies needing my name, just me, the water, and this long-awaited piece of paradise that now bore my name on the deed. For the first time in what felt like forever, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd sleep through the night without dreams about server meltdowns or impossible deadlines. I was only about half an hour into enjoying this new chapter when the sharp click of heels on gravel shattered the calm. It was jarring, like someone had yanked the needle off a record. I looked up and saw a woman cutting across the driveway like she owned the place. She wore a crisp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place among the trees, her every step precise, almost rehearsed. The breeze tugged at her hair, but she paid it no mind. Her eyes were focused, her expression unreadable. There was a certain stiffness to the way she carried herself, like she had already decided that this land was hers to claim. That should have been my first red flag. She was dressed like some kind of suburban general, a clipboard in hand, legal-looking folders tucked under her arm, and the self-important posture of someone who gets off on making other people squirm. No knock, no greeting, no introduction. She just began inspecting the property with a predator's focus, like she was appraising it for seizure. Her eyes moved from the dock, to the shoreline, to the cabana, each glance calculating. When she finally opened her mouth, her tone left no room for dialogue. "I'm Laura Kent, president of the Willow Lake Homeowners Association. We ensure the neighborhood maintains a consistent standard of living." Her smile was brittle, performative. Her eyes swept across my cabin with clear disdain. "You must be new," she added, her voice laced with condescension. "We expect all residents to meet certain expectations." The word standards landed like an accusation. Then she pulled out a mop, if you could even call it that. It looked like it had been scribbled by a bored child during math class. Wavy lines, barely legible markings, definitely not official. She jabbed her finger at the section of land near my dock as if she were identifying a crime scene. "This has always been part of the community space," she declared with confidence that didn't match the quality of her so-called evidence. The last owner understood that arrangement. I don't know how I kept my cool. Part of me wanted to laugh in disbelief. Did this woman seriously just march onto my property and tell me I didn't own it? I calmly asked to see documentation backing up her claim. In response, I brought out the official deed and property survey, both stamped and certified, clearly showing the land extended to the waterline. I laid them out neatly on the patio table like cards in a winning hand. "According to these," I said, keeping my tone even, "this entire area falls within my property line." Laura barely glanced at the documents before waving them away like an annoying bug. She kept harping on about a verbal understanding with someone named Walker, the prior owner, but something in her voice shifted when she mentioned him. She got defensive. Her eyes darted, just for a second. "Walker knew how things were done around here," she said, but she sounded more like she was trying to reassure herself than convince me. The way she invoked his name like it was some kind of unchallengeable authority I felt unsettling. There were understandings about community needs," she added, her voice tightening. It gave me the creeps. I couldn't help wondering what Walker had actually said and why she seemed so twitchy about repeating it. Before I could press further, she snapped back into her fake authority role with practiced ease. "This will be handled by the HOA board," she said, like she was reading from a script. "You'll learn the rules soon enough, Mr. Reed." The way she said my name made it sound like a threat. As she turned and walked back toward her vehicle, she kept glancing over her shoulder at the cabana as if she expected some Inya or something to be watching. I found myself turning to look, too. Just before she reached the end of the driveway, she looked back, her eyes locking with mine. Her voice dropped to a low, cutting tone I hadn't heard before. It stopped me cold. Her voice sliced through the air like a velvet-trapped dagger. "I think we need to have a conversation about your property," she said smoothly. "I trust you'll be reasonable." The words didn't land like a casual suggestion. They lingered, cold and unsettling. As her car disappeared down the long driveway, I felt a creeping chill settle over me. Something told me this was no ordinary neighborly chat. And oddly, I couldn't shake the image of Charles Walker, the former owner, smirking from beyond the grave. The entire encounter felt strangely rehearsed, like I'd just played my part in a scene that had already been written. I sat down again with my coffee, but whatever peace I'd felt that morning had evaporated. Looking back, I now know that intuition was spot on. What I thought was a one-off confrontation was just the first step into a much deeper and stranger situation. The following day, I returned from a grocery run to find a thick packet of violation notices jammed into my mailbox. One after another, each more ridiculous than the last. First offense: my red doormat, the one I'd picked because it reminded me of fall leaves and felt warm and inviting. According to HOA Rule 12.4, it was an unapproved color. The penalty: a $50 fine, due within 10 days, complete with a stern warning about maintaining visual consistency in the community. I read the notice twice, convinced it had to be a joke. I mean, seriously? A fine over a doormat? It's something people wipe their feet on. But that wasn't the end of it. That was just the opening salvo in what I later realized was a deliberately engineered pressure campaign meant to wear me down financially and mentally. The next morning came another notice. My lawn was allegedly half an inch taller than allowed. $75 for landscaping negligence. It had rained the night before, and the grass had grown barely, but apparently, Laura had either eyeballed it or pulled out a ruler to enforce her arbitrary standards. Day 3, a $100 fine for my wind chimes. Noise pollution, the notice claimed, supposedly violating the community's quiet hours, even though the chimes barely made a sound soft enough that even I had to strain to hear them from the porch. At first, I chalked it all up to annoying bureaucracy. Maybe I just needed time to adjust to the rules. But with each new citation, my tolerance eroded. I'd stand there, staring at the notices, wondering what exactly I'd done to deserve this petty war. There was no denying it. This wasn't about violations. This was personal, and I felt something begin to stir beneath the frustration, and not just irritation, but a sharper, more deliberate resolve. The methodical nature of her harassment was almost calculated, like she'd made a science out of psychological warfare. Laura was using a slow drip approach to death by 1,000 minor infractions. But instead of losing my cool, which I suspected was exactly what she wanted, I switched gears. I treated it like a glitchy piece of code. Systematically, rationally, I opened a spreadsheet, started logging every violation, took pictures, noted timestamps, geotagged everything. If she wanted a paper war, I'd outpaper her. My inner engineer took over. I began mapping patterns in her fines like I was analyzing behavioral data. It didn't take long to spot the bias. Laura's enforcement was far from consistent. It wasn't policy, it was personal. So I decided to investigate. I spent an entire weekend strolling around the neighborhood with my camera. If I was being held to perfection, I wanted to see what rules everyone else was following or ignoring. It didn't take long before I found plenty of violations. And the biggest offender? Laura herself. Her property was a jackpot of hypocrisy. A massive political banner blatantly violating the signage rules. A modified fence that didn't match the approved style. Her dog wandering freely. No leash inside against clear pet restrictions. I documented everything with the precision of a crime scene investigator. The irony was almost poetic. As I was organizing the mountain of evidence one evening, I met Tima, my neighbor from 2 doors down. He was carefully trimming his flower beds, but the way he kept glancing around made it seem like he was afraid of being caught enjoying his own yard. Tim looked to be in his early 60s, with the worn hands of someone who'd spent years working outdoors, but his jittery movements and hushed tone told me he'd been under the hose thumb for a long time. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking. "You seem decent, Oliver," he said quietly. "Charles Walker, the guy who owned your place before you. You're not the only one." Laura gave trouble. There was something in the way he said Walker's name, a mix of respect, sadness, and caution that made me pay attention. Tim leaned in, voice barely a whisper. "Charles was a good man, but she made his life hell during his last few years. Constant fines, harassment, all because she wanted that land." He scanned the area again, like we were sharing state secrets. "Before he passed, he said Laura would regret it someday. He was working on something, said it was his masterpiece. Claimed he'd leave her a reminder she couldn't ignore." A chill ran down my spine, not from the wind off the lake, but from the weight of what Tim had just implied. Masterpiece. I wasn't sure if I should be intrigued, a broken bar, or worried, but when Tim tilted his head slightly toward my cabin while saying the word, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. That night, I went down the rabbit hole. I started digging into Walker's history online, and what I uncovered was both fascinating and unsettling. News articles painted him as a kind of quiet rebel, a man known for exposing corruption through cunning architecture and bizarre, intricate setups. He didn't just fight back, he did it with flair. Walker was famous for his architectural mischief, structures that doubled as moral commentary. His pranks weren't just for laughs, they were sharp, purposeful, and always taught a lesson to the greedy or corrupt. There were stories, dozens of them, about how he embedded subtle, almost invisible mechanisms into his buildings, hidden features designed to humiliate dishonest tenants or expose liars exactly when the stakes were highest. One article recounted a particularly infamous incident. A city hall fountain he designed malfunctioned only during press conferences held by shady officials, dousing them on live TV. His obituary hinted that he'd spent his final years refining his greatest creation, his masterpiece, and with that context, everything Tim had said suddenly clicked. The next morning, I received a certified letter, delivered with all the pomp of a court order. The message inside? A summons to appear at a disciplinary hearing. Laura's name was signed at the bottom, bold and unmistakably smug. But what caught my attention wasn't the message. It was the letterhead. Walker's former address had been scribbled out and replaced with Laura's handwriting, a messy, unprofessional, and territorial. It was as if she'd hijacked something that still didn't belong to her. And tucked into the margin was a symbol I hadn't noticed before. It stirred something in my memory, a familiar, like a breadcrumb left behind intentionally. That's when it hit me. Laura wasn't just enforcing HOA rules. She was attempting a hostile takeover. She wanted what I had, and she was dressing up her campaign of aggression in the language of neighborhood policy. But this property wasn't just something I bought, it felt like I'd been handpicked for it. Like Walker had set all of this in motion long before I showed up, and I was starting to suspect that Laura had no clue what kind of storm she had wandered into. I buried myself in the HOA rulebook, trying to understand how far her reach actually went. But every section I read only deepened my suspicions. The structure of the rules felt intentionally designed to confuse, to deflect, to trap. What were they trying to hide? When the day of the hearing arrived, I showed up prepared for war. Laura had turned her dining room into a mock courtroom, with herself seated proudly at the head of the table like some suburban judge presiding over her own personal inquisition. 3 board members flanked her, obviously her alias, but they shifted uncomfortably when they saw me enter with a professional-grade briefcase and a neatly tabbed stack of evidence folders. They weren't expecting resistance. This kind of setup was usually enough to get homeowners to roll over, nod, and write the check just to make it all go away. But I'd spent years negotiating with ruthless corporate lawyers and dealing with aggressive investors, so Laura's theatrics didn't even make my pulse quicken. Before she could begin, I calmly placed a digital recorder on the table and spoke clearly. "I'll be recording this session, as permitted under HOA Rule 4.7 regarding homeowner rights during proceedings. The silence that followed was golden. Laura's mouth opened in protest, but I quoted the rule number and clause verbatim. The board members glanced at one another, suddenly aware that their words might be held accountable beyond the safety of Laura's dining room. Her confident smirk wavered. If she thought I was going to fold, she had severely misjudged me. I began presenting my case and order: a property deed, survey maps, title insurance, HOA stamped, sealed, and legally binding. I explained each document like I was giving a lecture to a courtroom, making sure even the most distracted board member understood its relevance. And still, they brushed it off like it was irrelevant. But then I flipped the script. Out came the photos, dozens of them, each labeled with dates, times, and GPS coordinates. Evidence of Laura's own violations of the very rule she'd been weaponizing against me. Oversized political signs, unauthorized fence alterations, her unleashed dog roaming the neighborhood. This was no longer about my doormat or lawn height. This was about her abuse of power. The reaction in the room shifted. You could feel it. One board member held up a photo of her sign, studying it like it was a revelation. The smug expressions around the table cracked as whispers and sidelong glances began to replace confident nods. But despite the mountain of evidence I had laid out, the board still voted against me unanimously. I watched it happen in real time. Laura shot them a look, and that was all it took. She declared a fine of $1,500, with additional daily penalties of $100 until I corrected the so-called violations. The satisfaction in her voice as she announced the penalty was enough to make my hands shaky, not from fear, but from fury. Then came the real kicker. Mr. Reed has 30 days to pay, or we'll place a lien on his property. She said it like it was already done, like she'd won. But for the first time, the board members didn't all look convinced. One of them shifted in his seat and spoke hesitantly. Laura, maybe we should reconsider the lien. That seems excessive for a doormat. You could almost see the light bulb turning on in his mind, imagining how absurd this would sound in court, how ridiculous he'd look trying to explain this to a judge, or worse, a local reporter. But Laura shut him down with a cold: the decision is final. Even then, I noticed a fracture. Another board member started taking notice, probably covering his own liability. That was the moment I stopped feeling like a victim. I stood up slowly, locking eyes with each person in the room one by one. You'll be hearing from my attorney, I said, voice calm but firm. And this recording will make excellent material for the lawsuit I'm about to file. I wasn't bluffing, and they knew it. Laura's expression cracked for a brief second. True fear crossed her face. She'd finally realized that I wasn't like the others. I wasn't going to roll over. I wasn't going to pay quietly and disappear. She had just created documented evidence of abuse, witnessed by her own alias, some of whom now looked visibly uncomfortable being part of her vendetta. And just like that, the power dynamic had shifted. Just when I thought I had a grip on the situation, I got a phone call from another neighbor. They said Laura had been going around the neighborhood again, tagging properties for assessment. Most names were random, but mine stood out. She wasn't done with me. In fact, she was already gearing up for her next move. I knew I couldn't waste another second. That's when I found Clara Stone. She came highly recommended as someone who didn't just take on corrupt HOAs, she dismantled them. The moment I stepped into her office, I understood why. Sharp-eyed, mid-40s, and all business, Clara cut straight to the core of my case without wasting a breath. While most attorneys would have seen billable hours and neighborhood drama, her office walls told a different story of framed letters from grateful clients, clippings from expose copyright tests on HOA corruption she'd toppled, even a plaque from a consumer rights group. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I wasn't alone. Most folks just pay the fines and give up, she said, flipping through my binder with interest. But you've got something here. This isn't random. There's a pattern, and patterns usually point to money. Let's find out what she's really after. I wish I could say I was confident, but the truth is, I was nervous. Taking on an HOA in court was one thing, and uncovering whatever lay beneath Laura's crusade felt like diving into dark waters. Still, I started digging through property records like a man possessed, and piece by piece, Things started clicking into place. But when I finally uncovered the truth, it hit like a punch to the chest. Laura hadn't just been enforcing rules. She'd been engineering this situation from the very beginning. My land wasn't just a trophy, it was a keystone in a much bigger plan. I spent 3 days combing through county records, scanning permit applications and zoning documents buried in a maze of bureaucracy that seemed intentionally tedious. It was the kind of system designed to discourage anyone without legal training or hourly pay. But persistence pays off, and public records can't legally be hidden from citizens who know where to look. That's when I found it. Nestled among stacks of construction permits from the last 12 months was a familiar name that made my blood run cold. Kent Brothers Construction, LLC. Permit after permit had been filed for a high-end lakeside resort development. The plans were detailed and expensive, via luxury cabins, a marina, upscale dining, and amenities that screamed profit. Millions of dollars in potential revenue if it could be built. But every application had been denied for one reason: insufficient vehicle access to the proposed site. Then I saw the map, and everything became clear. The proposed access road, it ran directly through my waterfront property. My land was the missing piece of their puzzle, the only viable way to get construction vehicles, supplies, and future guests to the development site. I had to sit down. The scale of it all hit me like a freight train. Laura didn't care about HOA standards. She wasn't defending community values or protecting neighborhood aesthetics. She was trying to clear a path for her family's business. Every fine, every violation, every fabricated rule was part of a calculated plan to push me off my land so her brother's company could profit from it. The whole campaign wasn't about law or order. It was about greed, camouflaged as civic duty. And Laura, she was abusing her position to weaponize authority against a single homeowner who stood between her and a massive payday. I wasn't just in a property dispute, I was smack in the middle of a family-run land grab. Clara was already digging into environmental filings when she hit on something even more explosive. That's when everything shifted again. She looked up from a document with raised eyebrows and the kind of satisfied expression people get when they stumble across a hidden treasure. Olivera broken bar, this changes everything. She slid the paper across the desk. Walker, brilliant, subversive, always one step ahead, had filed a conservation easement on the shoreline 8 years ago. That meant the land couldn't legally be developed at all. Any attempt to cut through that protected section of property would trigger federal violations, carrying steep penalties up to $10,000 per day. Clara's voice was steady, but her eyes gleamed with admiration. "This easement is airtight," she said. But why would Walker restrict his own land so severely? The answer slowly formed in both of our minds, and when it hit, it was nothing short of genius. Walker hadn't just wanted to protect the lakefront, he'd wanted to bait the trap. He knew someone like Laura would come along, as someone driven by greed, willing to lie, cheat, and bully to take control of the land. So, he'd made it legally impossible to build on it, while making it appear open to development on paper. He disguised his protection plan as vulnerability, baiting the hook with false opportunity. As Clara and I kept digging into Walker's past, more of his history surfaced: articles, blogs, even testimonials. His architectural career was littered with clever schemes that exposed corruption and punished dishonesty with poetic precision. One story described a retail complex he designed where the parking lot would flood only if the contractor skimped on required drainage. Sure enough, a shady developer cut corners and the building was surrounded by 3 feet of water the first time it rained. Lesson learned the hard way. Walker wasn't just an architect. He was a tactician, a moral engineer who built consequences into his blueprints. His designs were puzzle-esque, ones that punished greed with their own weight. And now, I realized I was living inside one of his final puzzles. The conservation easement wasn't just environmental, it was strategic. It was part of a larger plan designed to lure in someone like Laura and then slam the door shut when they overreached. And Laura? She was walking right into it, eyes wide shut. Clara leaned back in her chair, a slow grin forming on her face, not out of smugness, but out of admiration. Walker wasn't just protecting the land, she said. He was setting a trap. And you, Oliver, you were meant to spring it. Clara's voice carried a tone of certainty that made me stop cold. Oliver, I think Charles Walker predicted everything Laura would try. This easement, it's not just a shield, it's a trap. She spread the documents across the table like puzzle pieces, showing how they all connected. Let her make the next move, she said. She has no idea what she's walking into. And when she crosses the line, the consequences will be swift and devastating. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, I actually felt like I had the upper hand, but something still nagged at me. It was like I was playing a game where the rules kept shifting under my feet. Just when I thought I had every piece in place, a small but suspicious detail jumped out at me. A date on one of the documents had clearly been altered. That's when it hit me. Someone had been monitoring everything I did. Laura wasn't just navigating the rules, she was rewriting them to suit her needs. Now the real question loomed: should I sit back and let her self-destruct, or push things forward myself? Looking back, I realized I didn't need to make that decision. A Walker had already made it for me. All I had to do was let Laura's ambition carry her right where he'd wanted her to end up. My security system caught it all. While I was out picking up groceries, Laura came onto my property with a team of contractors. Watching the footage later felt surreal, like observing someone narrate their own downfall in real time. She was directing them confidently, pointing to the exact route she wanted the access road to follow, completely unaware the land she was trespassing on was federally protected. The audio was crystal clear. "Just get it started. We'll deal with the paperwork later," she told them. It was exactly the kind of smoking gun Clara said we needed. Laura wasn't even trying to be discreet. She was committing environmental violations with such reckless certainty it was almost jaw-dropping. Somehow, she believed her HOA title gave her authority over federal conservation law. When I got home, I found contractors hammering fence posts directly into the protected waterfront. Laura was barking orders, clearly frustrated with their slow pace. Watching her operate was like seeing someone step into a bear trap and complain about the design. The workers kept hesitating, asking about permits and environmental clearances, clearly aware something wasn't right. Laura brushed them off with the same bluster. "I am the HOA president. I'm taking care of the permits." Even from a distance, I could tell they weren't buying it. Eventually, one of the contractors stood up and said firmly, "Ma'am, we need to see valid environmental permits before we continue on this land." Laura's response? She threatened to replace them. That only deepened their suspicions. That's when I executed Clara's plan like clockwork. One call set off a cascade of official responses. Clara contacted the building inspector. I filed a property damage complaint with the sheriff's department. The county surveyor was called in. Every move was perfectly timed. Within the hour, my property was filled with officials, each arriving like members of a well-drilled team. It felt like watching a coordinated takedown, and the entire neighborhood gathered to watch it unfold. Tim was among them. He leaned over and whispered, "Told you Walker left traps." And then Laura's face shifted. The look in her eyes was unmistakable, panic mixed with confusion. She'd been operating with confidence just moments ago, and now she was visibly unraveling. Clara was the first to step forward. Dressed in a sharp suit and radiating command, she approached Laura like a prosecutor confronting a defendant. "Mrs. Kent, you are in violation of federal conservation law," she announced, loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "This land is protected. What you're doing is illegal." The building inspector started documenting the unauthorized construction. The surveyor marked out boundary lines using precise GPS equipment. The sheriff's deputy took photos and began writing up a report for property damage and trespassing. Laura, for the first time since I'd met her, looked afraid. Not annoyed, not arrogant. Truly, deeply afraid. This wasn't just a petty HOA feud anymore. She was facing federal charges, and she knew it. I laid out every piece of evidence, backed by dates, permits, easement records, and video proof. But as the HOA board looked it over, their expressions didn't change. They weren't interested in facts. Their silence confirmed what I had long suspected. This wasn't about who was right, it was about who had the power. Still, federal violations come with weight. The moment officials mentioned the $10,000 per day penalty, the contractors dropped their tools like they were red hot. They flatly refused to continue without valid permits and slowly backed away from the job site like it was radioactive. Laura tried to keep control of the situation, but her voice cracked under the pressure. "I am the HOA president," she shouted again and again, as if repeating it could somehow override the law, but it didn't. The sheriff issued a citation for trespassing. The building inspector ordered the project shut down immediately. The surveyor confirmed the fence posts were illegally placed on protected property. Then came the final blow. The contractors demanded to be paid for the wasted time and refused to remove the posts unless compensated again. Laura was left footing the bill for a job that had failed before it even began. As I handed over the last of my documentation, I noticed Laura's eyes twitch with anxiety. She was clearly shaken, though she tried to maintain a tight, practiced smile, but I could see the truth behind her expression. She knew it was over. Laura had always played the game of power through intimidation, and for a long time, I'd been just another piece on her board. She knew how to orchestrate the performance, with the neighborhood as her audience, but not this time. I wasn't going to let fear dictate my next move. Walker's plan had one final ingredient: public humiliation, and it was delivered perfectly. Neighbors who had spent years under Laura's thumb finally watched her dominance collapse live and in full view. It was like watching a stage magician get caught mid-trick. The illusion shattered. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had once been slapped with arbitrary fines for the most ridiculous infractions, leaned in and whispered to the person next to her, "That's the first time I've seen anyone actually stand up to her." Laura, humiliated, had no choice but to pay the contractors to remove the fence posts out of her own pocket. As she walked away from the scene of her unraveling, she turned back to me with a look of pure venom. "You have no idea what you're getting involved in, Reed," she hissed, voice thick with fury and desperation. But the truth was, I was starting to understand perfectly, and watching it unfold felt strangely satisfying. The board vote came quickly and decisively. I lost, but not really, and not in the way that mattered. As the final decision was read aloud, a chill ran through me, but when I looked back at Laura, her smug grin had vanished. Her eyes told a different story. She knew this wasn't over. She knew something worse was coming. And she was right. With Claire's help, I drafted a meticulous letter revealing every aspect of Laura's scheme. We included photographs of the damage to my property, copies of conservation easement documents, and a thorough timeline of her harassment, written like a prosecutor preparing for court. We didn't stop there. The packet included evidence of Laura's repeated HOA rule violations and proof of her family's financial interest in the land grab. Everything laid out so clearly, even the most loyal neighbor couldn't ignore it. That night, I went through each file again, one by one. The enormity of it all pressed down on me like a weight I couldn't shrug off. My hands trembled as I realized this peaceful retreat I'd once dreamed of had become a war zone. But once those letters were delivered, there would be no going back. The packet went to every house in the neighborhood. As I dropped the last envelope into a mailbox, I felt a strange combination of fear and defiance, like a rebel distributing flyers behind enemy lines. But sometimes, the only way to fight fire is with fire. Laura had used fear and intimidation for years to keep her grip on power. It was time for the truth to be louder than her threats. As I dug deeper, I uncovered something even more alarming. Laura wasn't acting alone. She had a powerful liaison within the community. People with vested interests in my property. This wasn't just one rogue HOA president. It was a carefully woven network of self-interest and manipulation. The response was immediate. It was like pulling the plug on a dam that had held back years of pent-up frustration. My phone started ringing within hours. Neighbors called, not just to express outrage, but to share their own experiences with Laura, many of which had never been spoken aloud until now. Mrs. Patterson, the sweet elderly woman next door, told me she'd once been fined $200 for painting her mailbox a cheerful yellow, apparently a violation of some unwritten aesthetic guideline. Mr. Rodriguez said Laura made him dismantle his kid's backyard playset because it clashed with the architectural mood, despite being completely hidden from public view. The pattern was unmistakable. Laura's abuse had been consistent and cruel. More and more calls came in that evening. Each one peeled back another layer of her reign of terror. She had been targeting the vulnerable seniors, young families, anyone too polite or overwhelmed to fight back. One resident revealed she'd been fined for having a bird feeder, accused of attracting invasive species. Another said her house had to be repainted 3 times because Laura kept rejecting the colors even though they were listed as pre-approved in the HOA guidelines. A retired school teacher confessed she was fined for displaying too many books in her window, supposedly because they created visual clutter. It became clear that Walker hadn't just anticipated Laura's type, he had built his defenses around her exact brand of tyranny. Within 48 hours, the neighborhood called an emergency community meeting. Laura tried to control the agenda like she always had, but this time, the crowd wasn't having it. The moment she opened her mouth, residents pushed back. No more intimidation, no more silence. The meeting hall was packed wall to wall. For the first time in years, people stood united against her. Laura's attempts to redirect the conversation were drowned out by a barrage of questions about the land grab, her personal interest in the development, and why she'd broken so many rules with impunity. Someone had printed copies of our evidence packet and passed them around the room. Neighbors flipped through photos of the fence posts, screenshots of HOA violations, and details about Laura's family's business. The effect was explosive. It wasn't just a confrontation, it was a full-blown reckoning. Laura tried to begin with a speech about preserving community standards, but the crowd cut her off with demands for answers. Conservation law violations, conflicts of interest, abuse of power. Clara calmly stepped forward and presented a clear, bulletproof timeline of Laura's actions. Every lie, every overreach, every dollar she tried to make at the community's expense. People had come for answers, and now they had them. One by one, the crowd began sharing their own personal run-ins with Laura's abuse of power, each account stacking higher on the pile of damning evidence. The momentum was building and fast. 2 HOA board members openly distanced themselves from her in front of everyone. "We had no idea there was a conservation easement or any link to her family's business," one of them admitted. "This changes everything." Her support base was collapsing before her eyes. Then Mrs. Patterson, the same quiet, elderly woman who had been a long-time target of Laura's petty tyranny, stood up with quiet resolve. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room with the kind of weight only hard-earned dignity can bring. "I move to remove Laura Kent as HOA president for misuse of authority and unlawful actions against this community." Before she even sat down, voices from all corners of the room chimed in with seconds. It was like thunder rolling through the hall. The vote was swift and brutal. 23-1. Only Laura cast a vote in her own favor. In a matter of minutes, she was stripped of her title, facing possible legal consequences, and socially disgraced in the eyes of the entire neighborhood. As it all played out, I stood there torn between the man I used to be, content with retirement and solitude, and the man circumstances had forced me to become: a fighter, a watchdog, a reluctant leader. But Laura didn't fade quietly into the background. Instead, she spiraled erratic and unhinged, like a trapped animal striking out in a panic. "You people don't understand what you've just ruined," she screamed, eyes wild. "Charles Walker promised me access to that waterfront. That land was supposed to be mine." Her outburst revealed what Tim and I had long suspected: Walker had made some kind of promise to her, and now she was fixated on what she thought she'd lost. But what she didn't realize was that this very obsession was pushing her directly into the final snare Walker had left behind. I wasn't just going to expose Laura, I was going to make sure her legacy was a cautionary tale no one in this neighborhood would ever forget. Then, just as I sealed the last envelope of follow-up documentation, a knock at my front door made me freeze. Standing on my porch was Laura, her eyes burning with rage. "I hope you know what you're doing," she growled, "because I swear, you're going to regret this." Without waiting for a response, she spun around and disappeared into the night. Later that evening, just as the community members were dispersing, Laura cornered me again, this time in a more frenzied state. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it hit like a lightning bolt. "You think this is over," she said, "but Walker's last laugh isn't what you think it is. There's something about your precious cabin you haven't discovered yet." Her expression twisted into a warped smile, somewhere between smug and desperate. It wasn't clear whether she was bluffing or holding on to one final truth, but something in her eyes suggested she still believed she had a winning move hidden away. It felt like talking to someone who lost everything and yet clung to a fantasy that they were still in control. As a last-ditch effort, Laura called for another emergency meeting, a final attempt to rally the community behind her and claim that Walker had intended for her to inherit the land. This time, she looked like someone barely holding herself together. Her usual polished appearance was gone, replaced by dark circles and a frazzled demeanor. She looked like she'd been living on stress and coffee. But even now, she refused to let go of her fixation. She clung to it the way someone clings to a sinking ship and unaware that it's dragging them under. As I entered the room, I could feel every eye on me. The mood had shifted since the last meeting. This wasn't support. This was an audience waiting to watch the final act of a long downfall. Then Laura stood before them all, her voice shrill and cracked. Charles Walker promised that waterfront would become community property after he died. Oliver Reed is stealing from every one of you. He's destroying this neighborhood's future just to serve himself. But the crowd didn't react the way she expected. They'd already seen the truth. Her accusations now sounded hollow, born of desperation rather than fact. As she spiraled, I stepped forward slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders. The room went quiet. Every eye turned toward me. Laura's earlier cryptic warning still echoed in my mind. There was something off about the way she'd said Ida, as if she knew something I didn't. But now wasn't the time for hesitation. I had to take control. Laura, I said clearly, I have just one question for you. The room was silent. Did you ever wonder why Charles Walker placed such an extremely restrictive conservation easement on my land 8 years ago? With that, I began to lay out the truth, piece by piece. I presented each document with care, letting the truth sink in one layer at a time. With every paper laid out, the audience reacted to gasps, murmurs, sideways glances. Every subtle response felt like a small, hard-won victory in the battle I'd been fighting. Laura's expression shifted rapidly from confusion to dawning horror as she began to understand the trap she'd walked into. It was like watching the sun rise over a battlefield, slowly revealing the full extent of the damage. That doesn't change anything, she snapped. He promised me access to that land for community use. But the panic behind her eyes betrayed her. She was starting to sense that this wasn't just about a broken promise, it was about a complete unraveling of everything she thought she understood. The truth was almost too poetic to believe. I had to give Charles Walker credit. His psychological foresight was staggering. Laura, I said calmly, you were right about one thing. Charles did want to see community development happen, but you misunderstood what that actually meant. The room went still. People leaned in. Everyone could feel the weight of the moment. You were never the target, I said. My lakefront land? That was never meant to be developed. It was bait. I unfolded a community map that Clara had prepared. It clearly laid out Walker's real intentions and Laura's fatal mistake. While you were busy coming after me, filing bogus complaints, breaking federal laws, obsessing over property you could never legally touch, and the real development opportunity sat untouched. Lot 7B has direct road access and absolutely no environmental limitations. Laura's face turned pale as realization hit her like a punch to the gut. 8 years ago, Walker's company secured development permits for that lot. They were valid for 8 years, renewable ones. That renewal window, it expired just 3 days ago. While you were throwing everything you had at me, the real opportunity was ticking away, right under your nose. Her brother's construction firm could have broken ground on Lot 7B at any point in the last 8 years illegally and without opposition. But Walker knew she'd ignore it. He knew she'd go for the land that was forbidden, thinking she could take it by force. It was a masterpiece of strategy. The entire room sat in silence, watching the collapse of someone who had built her downfall with her own hands. Walker didn't just bait a trap, he exposed Laura's nature to the community, giving them nearly a decade to see who she really was. His revenge wasn't loud, it was precise, surgical. Laura wasn't defeated by some clever loophole, she was undone by her own flaws, her arrogance, her greed. Walker merely set the stage. She provided the performance. Her expression twisted in fury, but I held my ground. For the first time throughout this ordeal, I was the one in control. She scanned the room, and neighbors she had intimidated, board members she had coerced, a community she had tried to dominate. I guess a broken bar I have to go, don't I? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson, quiet and gentle, simply nodded. Yes, dear, it's time. The community voted in a new whole leadership on the spot, one that promised fair rules, mutual respect, and protection for all property owners, not just the powerful. Laura's authoritarian rule was ended not by vengeance, but by process, unity, and the truth. Later that night, I sat in my cabin and read Walker's full letter. Oliver, if you're reading this, it means she took the bait exactly as I expected. That cabin was never about the land, it was about finding someone honest enough to finish what I started. Within 2 weeks, Laura had vanished, her family's business collapsed, and her name was mud across the entire region. The neighborhood began to thrive under the new leadership, clear policies, consistent enforcement, and a renewed sense of community. Property values rose, and word spread, this was now a fair place to live. 3 months later, I was back on my deck, watching the sunset reflect off the calm, protected lake, finally at peace, finally enjoying the life I had once come here to find. Back at the meeting, when the crowd had erupted in whispers and pointed fingers, I had turned to leave. Just before I reached the door, I caught one last look at Laura. Her rage had faded, replaced by something colder, calculated. She gave a smiley, chilling hello and whispered, "You've only won the first round. This game isn't over." I raised my beer toward the horizon, thinking of Charles Walker and his plan. "You didn't just protect this patch of earth, Charles," I thought. "You built a shield for an entire neighborhood." That was art, pure strategy. And it worked. Sometimes, when the lake is still at night, I swear I can hear Charles laughing in the breeze. Pleased, watching. So, if you've made it to the end of Broken Bar, what do you think? Is it really over? Or is there another chapter waiting to unfold? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if you appreciated the journey, consider supporting the channel. Until next time, ya stories, where neighborhood drama gets real, secrets come to light, and karma always shows up right on time. Stick around, we've got the receipts.